Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Great.
Yeah.
Today, we're going back to the JFK assassination.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but we're not going over the same ground everyone else does.
Okay.
We're focusing on what happened right after the shooting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those chaotic first few hours.
I see.
And we've got some really cool articles from the Fourth Decade Journal to help us out.
The fourth decade.
Yeah, they dig into witness statements and alternative theories.
Sounds interesting.
Oh, it is. Some of this stuff is, well, pretty wild.
I bet.
Our first article, it's by Tom Lyons, The Ruddy Link Between the Tippit Murder and the Texas Theater.
Okay.
It really dives into Lee Harvey Oswald, after the assassination.
Right.
Did he actually kill Officer J.D. Tippit?
Mm.
And how did he end up at that Texas Theater?
Right. Right.
I mean, it's almost like a puzzle,
Yeah, I know what you mean. Trying to piece together
Yeah.
what really happened based on sometimes conflicting accounts.
Exactly. And we're going to see how reliable those accounts actually are.
Interesting.
Like Helen Markham, for example.
Arkham.
Yeah. She's the one who at first told the FBI the Tippit shooting suspect had a red complexion.
Hmm.
But then she changed her story when she talked to the Warren Commission.
Really?
Years later, she went back to that ruddy description.
So she changed her story, then changed it back.
Uh-huh. Makes you wonder, about how reliable any eyewitness can be in that situation.
It does highlight the challenges of relying on eyewitness testimony, especially in such a chaotic and traumatic event.
Exactly. Like, were they influenced? Was it just stress? Or did their memories just get fuzzy over time?
Right. And those shifting descriptions could be anything from genuine uncertainty to, the malleability of memory,
Oh, yeah.
or even potential influence during the investigation itself. It's a classic case study in the problems with eyewitness testimony.
Totally.
Mm.
It makes you wonder how many other details might have gotten twisted, either by accident or on purpose during the whole investigation.
It's a valid concern, for sure.
And then we've got Johnny Brewer. He owned a shoe store.
Okay.
He saw this guy acting really weird right before Oswald got arrested.
Mm.
And guess what? The guy matched Markham's red-faced description.
Oh, wow. So that raises the possibility of, an Oswald lookalike.
Right. Like, was this on purpose?
Yeah.
Was someone trying to distract everyone while the real killer got away?
It's a fascinating possibility, the idea of someone intentionally drawing attention to Oswald at the theater while someone else...
Slipped away.
Exactly.
It's crazy. And then there's the whole thing about how Oswald even got into the theater.
Oh, right.
Brewer said he saw Oswald sneak in without paying. But Julia Postal, she sold tickets. She said she didn't even see him.
So, conflicting accounts again.
Again.
Right.
It gets weirder, too. Researchers like Leo Savage, Jim Mars, even a researcher named Jay Harris, they dug up even more inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And even some hints of, witnesses being pressured to change their stories.
Wow, imagine the pressure on someone like Julia Postal. I mean, suddenly thrust into the spotlight.
Oh, yeah.
The media hounding her, accusations flying around.
Yeah, it's a lot.
A lot to deal with.
So we have a potentially unreliable witness, maybe Oswald lookalike running around, and conflicting stories about Oswald even being in the theater. Where do we even begin to make sense of this?
It definitely casts a shadow of doubt on that official narrative. These inconsistencies, they don't necessarily prove anything definitively, but they raise some serious red flags.
Big time.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like someone's trying to hide something. Okay, let's move on to our next article from the Fourth Decade.
Okay.
This one focuses on a group called the Christian Defense League, or CDL.
CDL. Oh, yeah. They were deeply entrenched in those Cold War anxieties.
Right. They were led by Wesley Swift and William Gale.
Right. And they had this very potent blend of anti-communism mixed with this extreme ideology called Christian identity.
Okay, so for those of us who don't speak extremist group, what exactly is Christian identity?
It's a belief system that says white people are the true descendants of the Israelites from the Bible. And they view Jewish people in a very negative light.
It's scary how that kind of thinking can take hold.
It was a dangerous ideology, no doubt, especially combined with the CDL's fervent anti-communism and their opposition to the Kennedys.
Yeah, and it wasn't just talk. This article talks about guys like Charles Conley Lynch and G. Clinton Wheat. They were both part of the CDL and were connected to plans plans to attack Kennedy before the assassination.
That's right. Those individuals, they were definitely on the FBI's radar.
It's a chilling reminder of just how much some people hated Kennedy and what they might have been willing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder, how far were they willing to go?
Right. Okay, so the CDL had some pretty extreme beliefs, and some members had even threatened Kennedy. But did they actually have anything to do with the assassination itself?
That's where things get murky. Both the Warren Commission and Jim Garrison, New Orleans district attorney,
Right.
he did his own investigation. They both looked into people connected to the CDL.
Interesting.
And two names kept popping up, Loran Hall and Lawrence Howard. They were both involved in anti-Castro activities.
So anti-Castro stuff. What does that have to do with Kennedy's assassination?
Well, Hall claimed that he was actually offered a lot of money to kill Kennedy.
Wow.
An offer he says he refused. But, he also had connections to organized crime.
Oh, wow. Like who?
Figures like Sam Giancana.
Wow.
And as for Howard, his address book was basically a who's who of anti-Castro operatives, mercenaries, right-wing extremists.
Really? Wow.
Including some of the very people we've been talking about.
So the CDL was definitely connected to some shady characters,
Right.
but were they actually involved in the assassination?
It's hard to say. It's a really complex web of individuals and motivations. And while it's tempting to connect the CDL directly to the assassination, the evidence is, well, it's mostly circumstantial.
Okay.
But you can't deny their presence in this story.
Right.
It highlights just how intense the political and social climate was back then. And, that climate definitely played a role in what happened on November 22nd.
It's like, all this stuff was bubbling under the surface, and then
it boiled over.
Yeah. Okay, I want to be clear here. Just because we're talking about the CDL, exploring their possible role in this,
Right.
doesn't mean we agree with them.
Absolutely not.
Their ideology was dangerous and harmful. We're just trying to understand,
Yeah.
What their part in this whole story might have been.
Absolutely.
Now, get ready for this. Our next article is, well, it's kind of mind-bender. Yeah. It's by Don Scott. And he basically takes Gerald Posner's book, Case Closed, the one that argues Oswald acted alone.
Right.
It kind of tears it apart.
Interesting. And what's his take on it?
Well, Scott uses this really interesting approach. He calls it a negative template.
A negative template.
It's like, imagine you have a statue.
Okay.
And then you use the empty space around the statue to create a new, completely different statue.
I think I see where you're going with this. So he's basically using Posner's book, but focusing on what Posner might have missed.
Exactly. Scott says Posner's book is so focused on making Oswald look guilty that any inconsistencies, anything that doesn't fit, could be really important.
That's a pretty clever approach.
Right. And one of his most interesting theories involves Officer Marion Baker.
Baker, the officer who encountered Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository.
Yeah, the one who supposedly found Oswald just hanging out in the lunchroom right after the shooting.
Right. Sipping a Coke, if I remember correctly.
Yep. Well, Scott thinks Baker might have actually been assigned to, eliminate Oswald.
Eliminate, you mean kill him?
Yeah, to ensure he couldn't talk.
Wow. Are you suggesting that Oswald's capture was, in fact, a hit that went wrong?
That's exactly what Scott is saying.
That's a bold claim.
He really breaks down Baker's actions and testimony, the timing, where he was, the inconsistency.
And he thinks it was all a setup.
A setup to silence Oswald. And it only failed because Roy Truly, Oswald's manager, showed up unexpectedly.
That's a chilling thought. Oswald just casually sipping his Coke, Baker with his gun practically on him.
Yeah.
And Truly walks in, completely unaware of the deadly situation.
It's like something out of a movie.
It really is.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that this is just Scott's interpretation of the events.
Right.
We need to carefully consider all the evidence before jumping to any conclusions.
Absolutely. But it's a pretty wild theory, right?
It is.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about some of that, some of the most debated evidence. The bullet fragments, the pristine bullet, and of course that head wound.
This is where all three of our articles come together. It's really a fascinating mix of interpretations and unanswered questions.
It all starts with the Zapruder film. That home movie that caught the assassination on film.
Right, the the most scrutinized home movie in history, probably.
The way Kennedy's head snaps back, it's fueled so many debates.
Right. Does it support the single bullet theory, meaning the shot came from behind
Yeah.
or a shot from the front, maybe the grassy knoll? The film itself, it's important, but it can't tell us everything for sure.
And then you've got all those witnesses who say the first shot sounded like an explosion, not a gunshot.
Right. Potentially from the grassy knoll.
Exactly.
Those testimonies and the fact that the Zapruder film doesn't give us a clear answer have kept that idea of a second shooter alive for a long time.
But didn't the Warren Commission just, dismiss those witnesses, saying they were confused or something?
They did. They said they were misinterpreting what they heard, and that's been a big problem for people who don't agree with the official story.
Yeah.
Critics say the commission didn't give those testimonies enough weight, especially since a lot of them came from people who were very close to the shooting.
So we've got the commission sticking to their single bullet theory, while others point to the head snap and those witnesses as proof of something more going on.
It really shows you how different interpretations of the same evidence can lead to totally different conclusions. And it's important to remember, that the way Kennedy's head moves back, it doesn't automatically mean the shot came from the front.
Oh, really? Why not?
Well, some experts have said Kennedy's back problems, the injuries he already had, could have made his head move back that way.
Oh, I didn't know that. So the head snap, while shocking, it might not be the proof some people think it is.
Exactly. And about those witnesses who say they heard shots from the grassy knoll, we can't just take their word for it. We've got other witnesses who say the shots came from the book depository.
Right.
It's incredibly tough to separate real memories from what might have been distorted by time, by the trauma of the event, and even media coverage.
It's like, how do we even know what's real anymore?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it boils down to critical thinking. We can't just accept things at face value, especially with something as significant as this.
You're right. So much of this is about perspective and interpretation.
It is. And it's about questioning everything.
So how do we figure this out? What questions should we be asking?
We have to go beyond just the headlines.
Right.
We need to really dig into each piece of evidence, each witness statement, and what the experts say.
Yeah.
And just as important, we need to think about who's giving us the information and why.
That's true.
Are they biased? Do they have an agenda?
So it's not just about what's being said, but who's saying it and what their motivations might be.
Exactly. The JFK assassination is a perfect example of how different stories can be told about the same event, and each one wants to be the one everyone believes.
Wow. That's a lot to think about.
It is.
And speaking of competing narratives, what about that pristine bullet they found on Connolly's stretcher? The Warren Commission said that one bullet went through Kennedy's neck, then caused all of Connolly's wounds, and then landed perfectly intact.
Yes. The magic bullet theory. It's one of the most controversial parts of their findings, and rightfully so.
I read that even some of the people on the commission, they had their doubts about it.
They did. Even they thought it was pretty far-fetched.
But they still went with it. Why?
That's a question that's puzzled a lot of people.
Yeah.
Some say they felt pressure to present a united front, like admitting any doubts would just make people even more distrustful and spark more conspiracy theories.
So it was more about keeping things calm than finding the truth.
It's a possibility. Remember, this was a nation in shock, grieving.
Right.
They weren't just investigating a crime. They were trying to hold the country together.
Yeah, that makes sense. But does the pristine bullet theory actually hold up? I mean, scientifically.
That's where things get really complex. People who disagree with the single bullet theory, they say a bullet that went through two people, bones, all that, it should have been way more damage than that bullet.
Right. And weren't there other bullet fragments in the car?
There were. And some think those fragments could have come from the bullet that hit Kennedy's head.
So if those pieces came from different bullets, then the single bullet theory is, well, it's wrong.
Right. And it means there could have been more than one shooter.
Okay, but if the pristine bullet didn't go through both men, then how do we explain it?
Well, some researchers have talked about a phenomenon called yawing.
Yawing.
It's when a bullet tumbles in the air, so it hits the target sideways instead of head-on. Like imagine throwing a football.
Yeah.
Sometimes it spins perfectly and sometimes it wobbles.
I see. So the bullet could have hit Connolly sideways, done less damage, and stayed mostly intact. But isn't it a long shot that it would yaw just right to land so perfectly?
It's possible, but it doesn't explain everything. Like, how did the bullet travel? And where did the other fragments come from?
So we've got the magic bullet theory, this yawing explanation, and then the whole conspiracy angle. It's hard to know what to believe.
It is, and this is where understanding how science works is really important.
Okay.
We have to look at who the experts are, how they did their research, if they might be biased.
So, like we were saying before, it's about more than just the facts themselves, right?
It is. It's about the context, the people involved, everything.
It's like trying to solve a really complicated puzzle where some of the pieces might be missing or from a different puzzle entirely.
Exactly. And in a case like this, there might never be a clear and simple answer.
And maybe that's what makes it so fascinating.
Maybe so.
You know, it's amazing how much debate there is about, well, even the smallest details in this case.
It's true. And we haven't even gotten to the really big stuff yet.
Yeah.
Like, remember that controversy about Kennedy's head wound?
Oh,
The Warren Commission, they said, he was shot from behind, but that head snap we see in the Zapruder film,
yeah.
it makes a lot of people think the shot came from the front, maybe the grassy knoll.
Right. It's like everyone becomes a ballistics expert when they see that film.
It's understandable, I think. The footage is so powerful and people they want to understand this tragedy. But we have to remember that what we see, it can be subjective.
Right.
The film, it's compelling, but it doesn't actually prove which direction the shot came from.
And then you've got those witnesses who said they heard the first shot coming from the grassy knoll.
Right.
Yeah.
That definitely adds another layer of complexity.
It does. So we have these witnesses, we have the Zapruder film, and it all leads to, all this talk about a second shooter being on the grassy knoll.
Exactly. But remember, the Warren Commission, they dismissed those witnesses.
They did. They said they were just confused or misinterpreting what they heard.
Yeah, and that's been a major point of contention for people who question the official narrative. They say the commission was too quick to dismiss those testimonies.
Yeah.
Especially since many of them came from, credible people who were close to the shooting.
So we've got this clash of interpretations. The commission sticks to their single bullet theory,
right,
while others say the head snap of the witnesses prove something else happened.
And it shows how different interpretations of the same evidence can lead to completely opposite conclusions.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember the backward movement of Kennedy's head, it doesn't automatically mean he was shot from the front.
Really? I mean, it seems so obvious in the film.
I know, but some experts have suggested that Kennedy's back injury, the one he had before the assassination,
right,
it could have contributed to that backward motion.
So the head snap, it might not be the proof that some people think it is.
Exactly. And those witness accounts from the grassy knoll,
yeah,
while they're compelling, they can't be taken as fact on their own.
Right.
We also have witnesses who say they heard the shots coming from the Texas School Book Depository.
Of course.
It's incredibly difficult to separate what they really remember from what might have been, distorted by time, by the trauma of the event, and
right,
even by media coverage after the fact.
So how do we even begin to, to sift through all this conflicting information? What questions should we even be asking?
We have to think critically, I think.
Okay.
We can't just accept the headlines or the sensationalized theories. We have to look at the evidence, the witness accounts, what the experts say.
Right.
And we have to consider the people who are presenting that information.
Okay. So it's not just about what they're saying. It's also about who they are and why they're saying it.
Exactly. The JFK assassination, I think it shows us how different people can tell completely different stories about the same event. And each story wants to be the one that people believe.
It's a battle of narratives almost.
In a way, it is.
And speaking of different stories, what about that pristine bullet, the one they found on Connally's stretcher? The Warren Commission said it went through Kennedy, then through Connally, and landed perfectly intact.
Ah, yes. The magic bullet theory. It's one of the most, controversial parts of their findings.
Right. And I've heard that even some members of the commission, they had their doubts about it.
They did. Some of them thought it was, unlikely.
But they still put it in their report. Why?
It's a good question. Some historians have said they felt pressure to present a unified front.
Right.
That if they admitted they had doubts, it would just make people more distrustful and lead to more conspiracy theories.
So they were more concerned with keeping the peace, with keeping things calm, than with finding the truth.
It's a possibility. You have to remember, the nation was in shock. They were grieving.
Of course.
They weren't just investigating a crime. They were trying to hold the country together.
Right. Okay, but setting that aside, does the pristine bullet theory, does it actually make sense scientifically?
That's where things get, complicated. Critics of the single bullet theory, they say a bullet that went through two bodies, through bones and flesh, it should have been much more damaged.
Right.
And remember, there were those other bullet fragments they found in the car.
Yeah.
Some believe those fragments could have come from the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head.
Okay, so if those fragments are from different bullets, then the single bullet theory is, well, it's wrong.
It is, and it means there could have been, well, more than one shooter.
So how do we explain the pristine bullet if it didn't go through both Kennedy and Connolly?
Some researchers have suggested it could be a phenomenon called yawing.
Yawing. What's that?
Basically, it's when a bullet tumbles in the air, so it hits the target sideways instead of, head on. Imagine throwing a football.
Okay.
Sometimes it spins perfectly, and sometimes it wobbles. A bullet can do the same thing.
So if the bullet hit Connolly sideways, it might not have done as much damage,
Right.
and it could have stayed mostly intact.
Exactly. But it still doesn't answer all the questions.
Right.
Like, how did the bullet travel? And where did the other fragments come from?
It feels like we've got this puzzle with so many different possible solutions. We have the magic bullet theory, this yawing explanation, and the whole conspiracy thing. How do we know what to believe?
It is hard to sort through it all. I think in cases like this, it's crucial to understand how science works.
Right.
We have to look at the experts,
Yeah.
their methods, their qualifications, were they biased?
So like we said before, it's not just about the facts themselves.
I mean,
It's about the context.
Exactly, and who's presenting the information.
Yeah. This is really complex.
It is. And in a case like this, there might never be one clear-cut answer.
It's true. It's like a
Dig
puzzle where some of the pieces might be missing,
Yeah.
or even from a different puzzle altogether.
Exactly. And that's, I think, what makes it so fascinating.
It's almost like we're drawn to the mystery of it all.
I think that's a part of it, for sure.
Speaking of mysteries, let's go back to those events at the Texas Theater.
Okay.
Remember the official story?
Yeah.
It says that Oswald slipped into the theater without anyone noticing,
Right.
and then he was arrested after that shoe store owner called the police.
Right.
But we've seen how many inconsistencies there are in those accounts.
We have. The Texas Theater, it's almost like a mini version of the whole case.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Filled with uncertainty.
We have Johnny Brewer, who says he saw Oswald sneak in.
Right.
But then we have Julia Postal, who sold tickets,
Hmm.
and she says she didn't see him at all. And then we have those hints of witnesses being pressured and those conflicting statements.
Mm-hmm.
It's all very suspicious.
It is. It all suggests that Oswald's presence at the theater might have been more planned than accidental.
So instead of just being a desperate assassin trying to get away,
Yeah.
his capture was actually like a part of a bigger scheme.
It's a possibility worth considering, and if it's true, it raises some disturbing questions about who was behind it all.
And what their goal was.
Exactly. And as we peel back these layers, the story just gets more and more complex, and the implications more unsettling.
It's like you start pulling on one thread
Mm.
and then the whole sweater unravels.
That's a great way to put it. And, as we explore these alternative narratives, we have to confront the idea that the truth might be much more complicated and
Yeah.
maybe even more disturbing than we ever imagined.
Okay, so we have these questions about the Texas Theater, about the magic bullet, about the head wound. Is there anything that, that connects all these threads together?
That's where the political and social climate of the 1960s becomes so important. Remember, this was the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
People were distrustful of the government.
So the assassination, it wasn't an isolated event. It was a product of its time.
Exactly. And all those anxieties and tensions, they created the perfect environment for conspiracy theories to take root and grow.
Right. People were looking for answers, someone to blame. They needed to make sense of something that felt senseless.
It's a natural human response to tragedy.
Right.
When something terrible and unexpected happens, we try to find a reason for it.
Right. So the JFK assassination, with all its unanswered questions, its shadowy figures, it became like a magnet for conspiracy theories.
It did. And as the years passed, those theories evolved. They took on a life of their own.
It's like a story that changes a little bit every time someone tells it.
That's a good analogy. And
Yeah.
it's one of the biggest challenges we face, separating fact from fiction.
Right, right. But isn't that part of what makes history so interesting? The fact that we're still debating these questions, still looking for answers,
Yeah.
it shows how much this event still matters to us.
It does. The JFK assassination reminds us that history isn't just dates and facts in a textbook. It's about memory,
Yeah.
about the need to understand our past and the search for meaning and tragedy.
So we might never have all the answers about the JFK assassination, but the process of asking those questions, looking at the evidence, really talking about it, that's how we understand the past.
And it's how we understand ourselves, too.
It's true. We learn about who we are by looking at where we've been.
Exactly. The JFK assassination is a reminder that the past is always with us, in a way. It shapes how we think, how we make decisions.
It's a powerful legacy.
It is, and it reminds us to keep searching for truth and justice.
It does. So we've taken you through a deep exploration of the JFK assassination. We've looked at the inconsistencies, the controversies, and the mysteries that, well, they still fascinate and challenge us. But remember, this is just the start of your own journey of discovery.
We encourage you to, to read the articles we've discussed, explore different points of view, and come to your own conclusions about this event.
It's an event that continues to shape our understanding of history, and maybe even of ourselves.
I think so. And it reminds us that the search for knowledge, it never really ends.
And that's the beauty of it all. It's really incredible how, one event, like the JFK assassination, can lead to so many different theories and interpretations.
It really speaks to the power of those unanswered questions, the mystery that still hangs over that day in Dallas.
Absolutely. And we've been looking at the witness statements, the physical evidence, the whole political and social context.
Yeah.
But there's one more piece we haven't talked about, the media.
Ah, yes. The media. It's impossible to talk about the JFK assassination and not talk about the media, how they shaped what people thought.
Right. I mean, can you imagine the frenzy after the assassination?
Yeah.
The newspapers, the radio, the TV.
It was a huge moment for the media.
Yeah.
It unfolded live, right on TV, in people's homes.
Yeah.
That immediacy, that feeling of being right there, it was new.
It must have felt like the world had completely changed, and people were they were desperate for answers.
They were. And the media, well, they became the source of information, the way people understood what was happening.
But wouldn't that give them a lot of power, power to influence how people thought about the assassination?
Absolutely. What they chose to show, what they didn't show, it all mattered. It had a huge impact on how the public saw the assassination and what happened after.
It's like they were deciding what parts of the story to focus on and what parts to leave out.
That's a good way to put it. And it's important to remember the media landscape back then, it was different. There weren't as many sources of news, and people generally trusted what they saw and heard.
So the media had a huge responsibility to report accurately and fairly, especially given how sensitive and important this event was.
Exactly. But did they do that? Well, that's something people still debate.
Yeah.
Some argue that the media, trying to keep up with everything, trying to satisfy the public's need for information, they might have actually spread misinformation without meaning to.
How would that happen?
Well, early reports, a lot of times, they used unverified sources.
Right.
So they might have published incorrect or incomplete information. And sometimes maybe they were more interested in a sensational story than in getting it right.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the moment, I guess. Do you think the media's coverage played a role in, in fueling those conspiracy theories?
I think it's possible. They focused on certain evidence. They highlighted certain witness accounts. They gave a platform to people with their own agendas.
Yeah.
It could have created this atmosphere of doubt and suspicion.
It's really interesting how interconnected everything is. The media, public opinion, historical events. It makes you think, we have to be careful about what we see and hear.
We do. We have to question things, look for different perspectives.
Yeah, that's really important. So we've explored all this, the inconsistencies, the theories, the mysteries. What are your final thoughts on this whole complex event?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the JFK assassination, with all the tragedy, all the unanswered questions, it shows us just how powerful history is. It captivates us, it challenges us, it reminds us that, well, the past is never really over.
That's a good point. It's not just dates and facts in a book. It's an ongoing conversation.
Exactly. And as we continue to think about the JFK assassination, it's not just about understanding what happened then.
Right.
It's about shaping our world today and in the future.
Yeah. It's about understanding that history, it's not just in the past.
Yeah.
It's a part of us.
It is. It shapes how we see the world, how we make choices.
It reminds us to be careful, to keep looking for the truth.
Absolutely.
This has been a really incredible deep dive. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it, exploring this mystery with us.
It's been a pleasure to talk about this with you, and I hope everyone listening will keep questioning, keep learning, keep searching for the truth.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thank you for joining us. And remember, the search for knowledge never ends. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.